Muted.
Good morning and good afternoon for those on the East Coast. I'm Michelle Levander, Director of the Center for Health Journalism at USC. Thanks for joining us today for our Health Matters webinar, Beyond Flint, Tracking Lead's Toxic Threat, offered thanks to a generous grant from the National Institute of Healthcare Management Foundation. Together, we'll be exploring the toxic legacy of lead, neglect in so many cities with aging infrastructure. Flint forced us to pay attention, but well before that, our panelists have been exploring these hazards. We're hoping this webinar will help reporters and health policy thinkers draw attention to the causes of lead poisoning and prevent its deadly path. The road to prevention isn't glamorous. It involves looking at our water pipes, the paint in our old housing stock, and the air we breathe. Here to explain all this and offer their ideas for what we should be thinking about next are Dr. Bruce Lanphier, a professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and a lead researcher on lead poisoning as well as other fetal and early childhood exposures. Jessica Welburn, an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at the University of Iowa, whose research interests include race and ethnicity, social mobility, urban equality, and cultural sociology. Bree Zeltner, health reporter with the Cleveland Plain Dealer, who co-authored a Toxic Neglect, a 20-plus part series on lead poisoning and government inaction in Cleveland. And Allison Young, a reporter at USA Today's investigative team, who's been reporting on this on and off for more than 10 years. Reporting on lead contamination includes most recently the USA Today Network's Beyond Flint 2012 Ghost Factories investigation of lead-contaminated soil on Smelter sites. We are really looking forward to getting away. I just want to let you know that we have around 300 people registered for this, and so we can't call on all of you individually when we come to our Q&A. We're going to hear first from our speakers, and then we'll ask you to raise your virtual hand if you have a question for our speakers, and that you should also feel free, if you have any technical difficulties, to use our chat box or raise a virtual hand, and we'll try and help you. The hashtag for this webinar is lead, and we will be recording and archiving this for those of you who want to reference it later. And with that, we're going to get underway. Bruce, why don't you start out by telling us some of the fundamentals about lead and why we need to be so worried about it.
Greetings from Canada. Can you all see my screen and hear me? Great.
Yes.
Wonderful. All right, so what I'd like to do, I'm sure I've talked to maybe 20 or 30 of you over the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's been busy. What I'd like to do is give you sort of an overview on the toxic effects of lead, beginning with what I think many of us recognize as a seminal work of Dr. Needleman, where he looked at the amount of lead in teeth from over 2,000 school children in Massachusetts and found that as tooth lead levels increased, the ratings across a whole variety of behaviors and mental health issues, from impulsivity to dependability, distractibility, increased or became worse based on their homeroom teachers. As a result of those and other types of studies, the allowable levels of lead in paint, petrol or gasoline, plumbing, canned foods, and many other sources were gradually reduced. When I began my research in the mid-1990s, these reports showing this plummeting of blood lead levels were just being published, and some of my advisors recommended I get out of this line of work. The problem was going away, they said, and besides, there would be no funding. They were right on one account. There's been very little funding. It's been hard to get, but we were still troubled by the fact that in many parts of the country, including Rochester, where I was at the time, as many as 1 out of 3 children had blood lead levels of 10 microgram per deciliter or higher. And among African American children, it was 1 in 2 children who had lead poisoning. So the problem was, in many cities, still persistent, and there were still questions about the effects of lead at lower levels. So in this case, what I want to do is show you a very short video that looks at the impact of lead exposure in parts per billion. So here we go. In the 1960s, hundreds of children died from severe lead poisoning every summer. Since then, much lower levels of exposure have been shown to result in learning deficits and brain disorders like ADHD. In fact, the World Health Organization and other agencies agree there is no safe level of lead exposure. As the level of lead in children's blood increases from 0 to 100 parts per billion, IQ scores drop by about 6 points. In contrast, an increase from 100 to 200 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of 2 more points. An increase from 200 to 300 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of another point. The impact of toxins on the developing brain is permanent. Children who are more heavily exposed to toxins won't reach the same peak cognitive ability as those who have lower exposures. These studies show that there is no safe level of exposure. They also indicate that the way we regulate toxins, which assumes there is a safe level, fails to protect children. The chemical industry argues that the effect of toxins on children is subtle and of little consequence. But that's misleading. Little shifts in children's IQ scores have a big impact on the number of children who are challenged or gifted. Let's go back to our original sample of 100 children and look at a typical distribution of IQ scores. Most of us have IQ scores that fall between 85 and 115 points. Only 2.5% of children have an IQ above 130, which is considered gifted. There are about 6 million children in this group. On the other end of the distribution, another 2.5% of children have an IQ below 70, which is considered challenged. The impact of exposure to a toxin like lead causes a 5-point drop in IQ. This shift results in a 57% increase in the number of children that are challenged, from 6 million to 9.4 million. There is a corresponding decrease in the number of children that are gifted, from 6 million to 2.4 million. Little shifts matter. So that really gets at the crux of one of the biggest challenges in understanding the impact of lead, is that while for an individual child the effects may be subtle, on a population level they can be quite dramatic, leading to a large increase in the number of children who are intellectually challenged or have ADHD or other behavior problems. These types of studies also suggest that there is no safe level. In fact, for lead, at the lowest levels of exposure, there's proportionally greater IQ decrements than at higher levels. And this is a problem because, with the exception of carcinogens, toxicants are regulated as though there is a safe level. In 2012, the CDC finally lowered the allowable levels of lead and declared there is no safe level of lead. And yet, at the same time, almost within a month, they slashed the budget for CDC's lead poisoning prevention program from $32 million down to $2 million. That's been partially revived, but still too little money is going towards this problem. And it's not just intellectual abilities. This study shows that as blood levels increase in pregnant women, birth weight decreases. The estimated decrease in birth weight for women who have a blood lead of 5 microgram per deciliter is about 60 grams, which by itself, again, is quite subtle. But pregnant women are exposed to a whole host of different types of environmental stressors, including many toxins that increase the risk for low birth weight and, as noted in this next slide, preterm birth. This study was from Avon, England, where they found that women who had a blood lead above 5 microgram per deciliter were almost 2 times more likely to give birth prematurely. What about psychopathology? This study shows the impact of childhood lead exposure, mean childhood lead exposure, on gray matter volume or brain volume. And what you can see here is that the area in white and orange and red is the area of the brain most impacted by lead exposure. We found that children who had higher lead exposure, young adults, this was done when they were 23, who had higher childhood lead exposure had gray matter volume about 1 to 2% lower, and of course much greater loss in the prefrontal cortex. We also saw that the greatest impact occurred among males. This is important because the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that makes us most distinctly human and the seat of problems like ADHD and antisocial behaviors. We went on to estimate using NHANES, or a national survey, that about 1 in 5 cases of ADHD could be attributed to lead exposure. Imagine, if you will, what the impact would have been if I had designed a drug or a vaccine that could prevent 1 out of 5 cases of ADHD. The fact that we could show you could prevent it got some scholarly attention, but not much else. This is a study from New Zealand that mirrors what we found in Cincinnati. That is, as childhood lead exposure increases, whether you measure it with blood lead or tooth lead, we see an increase in both self-reported criminal behavior as well as official arrests or convictions. This is adjusting for a whole host of other factors, including parental criminal offending, parental alcoholism, maltreatment, and other things, and is really quite robust. And you can look at secular trends in the United States over the past century and see that as lead exposure tracked with a lag of 21 years, toddlers are more heavily exposed. It's the young 15 to 25-year-old males in particular who are involved in violent crimes like homicides. You see this striking correlation. Jessica Rees, an economist, went on to show that over 50% of the decline in violent crimes in the past 3 to 4 decades could be attributed to the decline in blood lead levels. Less than 30% of all of the factors, including the number of police on the police force, accounted for the rest. So lead appears to be the major reason for this epidemic of crime in the past century. And while it's always hard to adjust or account for all other factors when we study humans, when we don't dose them with lead, we can look at animal studies like a golden hamster model that showed if you expose these golden hamsters to low levels of lead, they're much more likely to attack without provocation compared to their controls. How big of a deal is it? Economically speaking, for every dollar we invest, we would save a low of $17 as a society and a high of $220. That's better than childhood vaccines. It's better than air pollution controls. It's as good as it gets in terms of cost-benefit analyses. Finally, just to put into perspective the major sources, we're focusing understandably on water right now, and water is important. We found in Rochester it accounted for about 20% of children's blood lead levels, dust lead about 30%, soil ingestion and soil lead about 30%, and renovation for about 10%. And I want to end with this slide, which maybe gives you some ideas about what I think are some of the important unanswered questions, as well as steps to eliminate lead poisoning globally and in North America, which is achievable. First, to set a goal to achieve blood lead levels less than 1 microgram per deciliter by 2030. Eliminate all non-essential uses of lead worldwide, and car batteries right now are the only essential purpose of lead, and develop regulations to control emissions. Establish empirically derived health-based standards for lead in air, house dust, soil, and water. Virtually all the standards out there were based upon what was thought to be feasible to attain, not what was based on the science. They're also all obsolete. They have not kept up with the new idea that there is no safe level of lead in blood. Screen housing units for lead hazards before purchase or occupancy, after renovation and abatement, and finally develop a national strategy, which will be 10 to 20 or more years to replace lead lines and replace or cover contaminated soils. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We're going to turn now to Jessica Welburn, who's going to be talking about structural inequality and race in Flint.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. So yes, today I'm going to be talking just briefly about, I think, some of the structural factors that create conditions that enable situations like the lead poisoning crisis in Flint to occur. So the first issue I want to talk a little bit about is deindustrialization that began in the mid-20th century, and this is perhaps most famously talked about by sociologist William Julius Wilson in his book, The Truly Disadvantaged. And the argument there, right, is that a lot of major cities in the Midwest and in the Northeast experience significant deindustrialization, which is the declining availability of well-paying manufacturing jobs as the economy transitioned to a service economy. And so there were a number of people who were left particularly vulnerable without adequate employment opportunities because of this shift in the type of jobs that were available in the economy. So you saw, particularly African Americans, you saw a lot of people moving to cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, like Flint, in the early and mid 20th century, to take hold of these well-paying manufacturing jobs, move into the middle class, and then you saw them start to evaporate. So where you saw the industrialization, you saw white flight, which is the movement of whites out of the city into the suburbs. Deindustrialization is not the only cause of this, but it is one cause. Service jobs often tended to be available outside of the city, and so whites with resources were able to move out of cities to these jobs, and also away from African Americans that they didn't want to live in close proximity to be honest. And so you saw a lot of white flight. You saw, limited job opportunities, limited well-paying job opportunities. As we well know, some of these manufacturing jobs were replaced with, hourly service jobs that simply are not suitable in order to make ends meet. So you saw increasing poverty rates in a number of cities, shrinking tax bases, and the limited availability of public services. And so people who live in cities now that have experienced significant deindustrialization end up living in neighborhoods that have very few resources, concentrated poverty. So this means not only high poverty rates, but high poverty rates in neighborhoods that are in close proximity to each other. And so you have a lot of people in small geographic areas living above the poverty line. You also see intense racial residential segregation. And Flint is sort of a classic story of deindustrialization, right? You saw most famously, probably talked about in Michael Moore's film Roger and Me, the exodus of well-paying manufacturing jobs, particularly with the closing of General Motors plants in the 80s and 90s. And so the exodus of high-paying blue-collar jobs. You also saw, coupled with that, significant population decline. So the population in Flint has basically been cut in half since 1960. And you also see Flint flip to being predominantly Black over the past several decades. So white flight in Flint actually hasn't been as significant as it has perhaps been in other cities, but you see that whites make up about 37% of the population, and African Americans make up about 57% of the population. You also see the median household income is about $24,000 a year in Flint, which is like half the median household income for families in the U.S., and the poverty rate is about 42%, which means almost half of Flint residents are living below the poverty line, and many of them are African American. The unemployment rate actually reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is about 5.5%, which doesn't sound particularly bad, except that what happens is that, as we hear a lot probably on the news, right, that some of these rates don't capture people that have permanently dropped out of the workforce. So if you look at the percent of the population that's actually employed full-time, it's about 50%. So you have a lot of people that are not working and that have probably permanently dropped out of the workforce in Flint. So this sort of creates, a situation, again, where people have limited opportunities. They're isolated. Oftentimes, residents of these cities are African American and also Latino, and often have less access to economic resources. And so they become essentially trapped in cities like Flint with limited opportunities. This is also coupled with broader trend of the shrinking of the public sector. So not only have cities experienced significant deindustrialization in the Midwest and the Northeast, but cities across the country are navigating what is the general retrenchment of the public sector and the dominance of what some would argue are neoliberal policies. So neoliberalism is the idea that the market basically it should play the most important role in determining individual outcomes, and that there is not really state intervention needed to do things like equalize the distribution of resources and limit inequality. So this kind of ideology plays a significant role in shaping what is available in cities across the country. So the National League of Cities did a great report in 2014 interviewing mayors from across the country, surveying mayors from across the country, and they point to the fact that cities are facing shrinking budgets, and it's not just because of the issue of deindustrialization, shrinking populations, but there are also broader federal and state level issues that are leading to cuts. And so I've put a quote up on the screen from the National League of Cities report that you guys can read. It's a little cut off on my screen, so I won't read it out loud to you, but hopefully you can see it. And so, so this creates a situation where cities are having to navigate not having a lot of money on average to deal with the populations that they serve. And so this can contribute to fewer public sector jobs, cuts to basic city services, and sometimes the privatization of services. Can be anything from police to garbage collection. Also see cuts to public schooling. We see a lot of cities increasingly relying on charter schools, and cuts to other resources, whether it be the public library system or the or public recreation centers, things that you take for granted as being a part of your daily life. In a city, I know I take them for granted living, in a pretty good city like Iowa City, but, in a lot of major cities, these things are being cut back. And so we've essentially created a perfect storm for populations in cities, particularly minorities and people with fewer economic resources, where there are limited opportunities for stable employment, there are high poverty rates, and increasingly limited public services. And this can create a situation in which people have really very few tools at their disposal to navigate the obstacles that they face and to advocate for themselves, and create situations where they're vulnerable to things like lead poisoning and a host of other things, high crime rates, limited health resources, all those things. So I'm doing some research in Detroit on how African Americans are navigating the circumstances there. I'm working on a book on this, and I find that the people in Detroit, and I imagine the situation is similar in Flint, have to spend a considerable amount of energy basically filling in the gaps of an absent public sector. So they essentially have to play the role of the state in their daily lives, whether it be navigating high crime rates, finding good schools for their children because the public schools are insufficient, or just finding basic transportation because there's not a sufficient public transportation system. So again, all these things that you expect end up being absent, and so people who have limited resources end up having very vulnerable to a lot of the negative impacts of decline. And I just want to briefly, I have 1 minute left, highlight, I'll put this slide up, and highlight Michigan's emergency financial management law, which is another contributor, I think, to some of the problems we're seeing in Flint. So Michigan's one of the few states in the country that has where the governor has the ability to appoint an elected official to a city determined to be in financial distress. And this person, called an emergency financial manager, has the ability to take over the city's finances and make decisions that are, supposed to allegedly be to improve the financial well-being of the city. But what happens often is that emergency managers make decisions that take control away from elected leaders and from the citizens, and these decisions can be potentially harmful. So in Flint, people actually had clean water for decades, and then an emergency manager was put in place who was able to basically unilaterally decide to switch the source of the water in order to allegedly save money, and citizens and elected officials had limited say over this. And this is happening primarily in predominantly Black cities, so Flint, Detroit, Highland Park, and Benton Harbor. So you have these broader structural issues, and then you have some Michigan-specific issues that make people increasingly vulnerable to things like the water situation in Flint. And I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We're going to turn now to Bree, who's going to talk a little bit about the reporting challenges that she faced in her incredibly rigorous and systematic investigative series about the toxic neglect of lead in Cleveland.
Hi, everybody, from Cleveland. So for the past year, I've been reporting on lead poisoning for the Plain Dealer, partnering with Rachel DeSalle, an investigative reporter here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience and some of the obstacles we ran into that might be obstacles you also run into if you are reporters and planning on tackling the subject. So in light of the attention that the crisis in Flint has received, a lot of local reporters are now looking into their own cities and asking if lead poisoning is a problem for them too. As Bruce mentioned, lead paint is the most widespread high-dose source of heavy metal for infants and young children. Water, as we saw in Flint, only accounts for about 20% of lead exposures. And it's usually lead dust and paint chips that cause the problem, though there is obviously still the issue of lead in soil from leaded gasoline, and that's something that I think Allison's going to talk about a little bit more. So the sad truth is that it probably is a problem where you are. Its levels aren't going to be as high as Bruce was showing in the 90s, but as we now know, no level of lead is safe for kids. So we started our reporting last summer and published our initial series in October. We ran into a number of obstacles that you might also expect if you take on this subject, and some of those were, general apathy, a lot of myths and misinformation around the subject, difficulty in getting and understanding the data around the issue, loads of necessary public records requests, and just a ton of excuses and difficulty in finding good solutions that are out there. So I'm going to just kind of address each of these quickly and how we tackle them. So as soon as we started writing about the issue of lead poisoning here in Cleveland again, which is something the newspaper has tackled probably every decade for quite a while, we saw a lot of the myths that that people have about lead poisoning come out pretty quickly, including that it's no longer an issue, that it's just bad parenting, that it's only an urban issue, that's really it's only sick or even unintelligent kids who get lead poisoning, because they're only stupid kids are the ones who eat lead paint chips or paint chips in general. So we tackled that in a number of ways, doing stories directly addressing the myths, also addressing them in individual stories that talked about the issues of race, history, and the health impacts of lead poisoning in general. Getting and understanding data is going to be an issue for anybody. There's a lot of data sources out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the data collection nationally isn't uniform, so you can't. And I think some reporters have already run into this problem. It's very difficult to compare city to city because of that. So this you can see here. It's a little bit hard to read, but you can see here what you would find if you looked for the state of Ohio, going back to 1997 on the CDC's site, which is the National Center for Health Statistics. And one of the first things to note, which we ran into and had to learn a lot about, is that what's reported is the percentage of children that are tested, and that isn't necessarily representative of the problem because screening rates are not what they should be in a lot of areas. So this next slide is showing we got some help from Ohio State's the Kirwan Institute for Race and Ethnicity. Some of their very smart statisticians there helped us kind of figure out, use that data and some of their the work that they'd already been doing to figure out what the likely proportion of children actually exposed to lead is. This is looking at Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is. And so we found it to be a lot higher than the reported data. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm happy to talk about that when we have time for questions, but it has to do with whether kids are being screened at the rate that they should be, and maybe bias in which kids are getting screened and which kids are getting to the doctor when they should be. Public records requests. You probably, if you want to get into the issue deeply, you probably have a lot of them. We still have dozens that are outstanding locally and state level. Some of them dating back to when we originally started reporting. Lessons learned to know what you want when you start, and that's pretty much reporting 101. You know, obviously no FOIA, no what the timetables are, know when, you know, to check back in and what your rights are. And also something to be aware of is HIPAA. Most of you likely know that you know, it's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which protects, you know, patients' medical records, private information, but we found that it's used a lot and misused to deny access to some of these lead-related records, and we've had to fight that, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And again, be happy to talk about that more. HUD has a lot of records on the work that they do in partnering with cities and states to do lead abatement. So we definitely made a lot of requests to them. We tried on our own to make lead safe registry, and it's the HUD records that are actually used to make those available. So you could look and see if that's available in your city or your state. Some cities and states publish that, and that just wasn't the case here in Cleveland, and we're still working on that. So I'm not going to go into all of the exclusives that we've heard as to why things haven't changed, but there have been quite a few. And the way we've chosen to respond is to find other cities, states, school districts, you name it, that have given up on excuses and found solutions to the problem, even if it's just in part. So examples include Rochester, New York, where a set of really preventive lead poisoning ordinances have helped reduce by 80% the number of children with elevated blood lead levels. There are states like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut that require universal screening of children at certain ages, and in some states and in the District of Columbia, doctors have to provide parents with proof that their child's been screened before they can enroll in daycare or kindergarten. So I would say, you know, what stories are still to come. There's a lot still to do. One of the things that we've heard repeatedly is that we have to keep pressure on, otherwise everything's just going to stay the same, and that was one of our goals. And we've written more than 50 stories since October, so we're still at it. We're still looking for solutions. Solutions remove excuses. We're following up locally with these meetings that our public officials are having on the issue, and I guess that would be our advice, is just not to let it drop if you plan on diving into the area. And happy to answer any questions that come up.
Thank you so much, Bree. I know that we already have some questions for you. We're going to turn now to Allison Young from USA Today, whose recent investigative reporting project found excessive lead in almost 2,000 water systems across all 50 states. Allison?
Hi, everyone. So obviously water has been so much in the news right now because of Flint. But as you saw on Dr. Lanfear's slides, the issue of soil and water and dust are also really important risk factors. They often receive little attention from public health officials and from the news media. So I'll be giving some tips and some resources for reporting on soil and water contamination, largely based on two investigations we've done on our USA Today investigative team. The most recent one is our Beyond Flint series, which began publishing last month, which examined the issue of lead-contaminated water in communities nationwide. And the other is a series from 2012 called Ghost Factories, which revealed failures by the EPA and state environmental regulators to investigate lead-contaminated soil around hundreds of long-closed and generally forgotten lead smelting sites from coast to coast. You know, and what we found is we looked into these sites, which had been flagged to the EPA's attention by an academic researcher, that even when they did go out and investigate, and in the small subset of cases where they actually did test soil around these sites and found hazardous levels of lead, and even documented the potential of plumes on these neighborhoods, that they failed to alert residents who were living nearby. And so among the key questions that were at the root of both of these investigations, and that I think that are at the core of stories still to be done in this area, is trying to get at how significant and extensive is the contamination in both soil and water in our communities. What is being done to evaluate that contamination and to protect the public? And that's not just by government, which we need to look at that very closely, but also the role of industry and what they are doing. And then also, what does the best science say about the risks? And how does that compare with the actions that are being taken both by government and by industry? So our current Beyond Flint project, we wanted to find out the extent that communities beyond Flint, Michigan were facing lead contamination issues. What we found was, I mean, to be sure, Flint appears to be an extreme outlier. They went about changing their water source, put a highly corrosive river water into a water distribution system without adding anti-corrosion treatments, and it essentially stripped lead and other metals out of the insides of pipes. But what we found as we looked into this, and you know, is that the fundamental risk factor that occurred in Flint is present in millions of communities across the country and millions of homes, which is these old lead service lines and lead in the plumbing in our individual homes. But we looked closely at regulatory records and found that nearly 2,000 water systems across the U.S. had failed to meet the EPA's lead standards for drinking water in the past 4 years. And those systems, many of them are smaller, but collectively they serve 6 million people. About 373 systems failed repeatedly on these lead tests that are required under federal regulations, and continue to fail those tests, sometimes for months or even years, the data showed. And one of the other huge issues with this is that, you know, we, the public, have to take a role in protecting ourselves from lead in water. But there's no way you can know to do that if you're not warned of the problem. And there are a couple of areas of issues here. One has to do with whether we are doing enough in this country to educate the public about the lead risks beyond paint. And number two, whether or not when excessive levels of lead are found in this government-required testing, whether people in the communities served by these water systems are being notified. And our team's review found that of the 2,000 systems that had these action level exceedances for lead, about 180 of them were basically cited for failing to notify customers about the high lead levels in their systems as the federal rules required. And it's important to note that, you know, when we're talking about these 2,000 systems that basically triggered and had this action level exceedance under EPA rules, we're talking about a subset of communities where people are consuming water with excessive or dangerous amounts of lead. Because the reality is that how testing is being done under the regulatory system, it's not testing every single tap. And that's something that's really sort of important to know about this. And so one of the things, I mean, for anyone who's out there who's thinking about reporting on the area of water in the wake of these Flint crises, is the issue of really understanding how lead gets into drinking water. Unlike so many other contaminants, it's not something you can filter out at the treatment plant. The biggest problem is coming through these old pipes that were installed decades ago. And this little graphic, little red line that you see there, that is part of what's called the service line. You have the big water main out in the street, and then you have this pipe that comes from the main out in the street up to your meter box and then into your house, and that's the service line. Part of the challenge going forward from a policy issue of dealing with is the part that's shown in red here is generally the part that's owned by the water utility. And then the part that extends on into your house is often owned by the homeowner. And so you have potentially split financial responsibility for these lead service lines, as well as you have all of these lead components inside homes. But the issue of how lead is being contaminated at individual properties makes the regulation really very difficult to administer and to get a sense of what's going on across an entire city, because homes vary so greatly in the amount of lead that's in their plumbing. And so knowing how water is becoming contaminated is important in terms of how you gauge whether or not the system is working. I would also say that on the area of soil, when you're talking about old factory sites, that was airborne, dropping of lead onto soil from above. And so when looking at testing protocols and how we are examining and testing to see how contaminated an area is, that lead, for the most part, if left undisturbed, will remain in the top inch or so of the soil. If you look at testing protocols and you see that they're taking a 12-inch core sample and mixing it all together, it's worth taking a closer look. Is that going to dilute the amount of lead that is being found in that sample? So knowing how something gets contaminated makes a difference. It's really important to know the rules of the game when you're reporting on lead or lead water or soil contamination. In the area of water, it's the EPA's lead and copper rule, which is truly the ugliest, just most complex rule that I've encountered reporting on bureaucracy for many decades now, and even people who are regulators hate it. But you need to understand what those numbers are you're seeing. For the most part, when a system is found to have had an action level exceedance, it's not just that they had one or two tap water samples that were above 15 parts per billion. It's because they had more than 10% of them, this thing called the 90th percentile value. So knowing what the numbers mean. If you're going to do reporting on the area of drinking water, you're going to want to take a look at the EPA's SIDLIS data. They do have data that you can download from the web. You'll need to get their PR folks to get you to the direct link because it's not readily findable. But there is data online telling you which systems have had action level exceedances, what their 90th percentile lead reading was that triggered that. But the data is very dirty. My partner on this project, Mark Nichols, spent an extraordinary amount of time cleaning up the data, deduplicating it, and even then there are issues with the data, but it's that resource that reporters and public officials have in sort of looking at which systems are not meeting standards. I would encourage looking at the numbers and what they mean. You heard earlier that we need to update standards in this country for contamination and risk issues. The EPA has an action level for lead in water of 15 parts per billion. Unfortunately, a lot of what I read in media reports, the public, I think, assumes that 15 parts per billion is a safety standard. It is not. It was not intended to be. It is what the EPA calls a treatment technique standard. Essentially, it is the level that was believed to be achievable to reduce lead in drinking water by industry with corrosion control alone. But it is not considered a safety level. And so looking closely at what the various levels are out there and what the science is for them is an important thing to do. Lastly, I would say on soil, there's a ton of reporting that can still be done in this area. There are old factory sites all over the country. Some of them have been evaluated. And my biggest piece of advice is if you get a report and the report says, oh no, there's no risk from that old site, there's no danger to anyone, think about this photo that is at the bottom of the slide. So on the other side of that wall for many decades was an old lead smelting site. And that particular site was deemed to not pose any risk because it's capped with cement. And it was mothballed in terms of files. When we did our investigation, instead of just relying on the report, we looked at Google Earth and Street View maps and saw that there was a public housing development directly next door with a playground. The airborne emissions from factories don't know property boundaries. But unfortunately, too often environmental assessments don't take that into account. And I will stop there because I'm out of time.
Thank you so much, Allison. We're going to open it up to questions. And if you all don't mind, I'm just going to start with one of my own, which is to pick up where Allison left off, talking about the disparity of somebody living in a housing complex right across from a factory that's spewing out lead. What would you recommend, Bree and Allison, on how we think about covering these stories when it comes to the race and disparity angle?
This is Allison. I mean, one of, I think, the great story ideas to look at is disparities. You know, who is getting their soil tested? What communities or what neighborhoods do environmental regulators come in and invest the money to do soil surveys and take those tests? And also, when do they get cleanups? And, you know, what role does urban versus suburban play? Smaller cities, what role does political pressure and a community's wherewithal to raise a big stink play? And it seems, I mean, anecdotally from the sites that got cleanups in the wake of our ghost factories investigation, those things do play a factor in where cleanups are occurring. One of the sites for ghost factories that had the highest levels of lead contamination we found in our own soil tests is a Philadelphia site called the John T. Lewis Factory, which is surrounded by residential homes directly across the street and all around it with little yards. You have very high levels of lead in many of those yards. And what you hear from public health and local officials is, oh, that lead in their backyard is probably the result of paint or from freeways, not from the lead factory that operated for 100 years directly across the street.
Right. This is Bree. I would just add that that you know, it is obviously a big part of the story, and it's no mistake that the people who are disproportionately affected by lead poisoning, whether it's soil or water or otherwise, are people living in substandard housing, generally in urban areas with a lot of disinvestment, and you know, that's, you could write a book about it, and books have been written about it, about why, you know, these issues affect these people, and it's not just lead poisoning. Obviously, there are a whole host of other housing-related issues, health issues that affect the same people. So it's something that I think that you know, if you're going to report on it, you will run into, and that, you know, as reporters, we have a responsibility to address when we do write about it.
And Jessica and Bruce, did you want to add anything on this point? So I'm going to take some other questions here. One is from Kristen Gourlay, and it's for Bree. And the question is, what are some of the documents and records that you FOIA'd? And a related question from Daniel Telvok, which HUD records?
Hi, Kristen and Daniel. Actually, I can answer that in one. So it was the FOIAs and the HUD, you know, we FOIA'd HUD, so it's the same answer. So we tried to get records on, because Cleveland doesn't have a registry of homes that have been cleared or abated of lead, or even just a list of the homes that have had work done through the grants that HUD gives for abatement. We try to get access to those records ourselves, to put that together ourselves for readers, for residents. So we requested the records from HUD because they, you know, we figured it was the best place to get them, because they have all of those dating back to when the city first started, city and the county first started getting grants from HUD, which I believe is back in the early to mid 90s. What we found is that you know, databases changed. It was a large volume request, and a lot of it was not, what we ended up getting back was not even, it wasn't usable because of an exemption that they cited due to HIPAA. So we don't believe that that's, we're appealing it, because the data that's given to them is de-identified, and actually when the cities and counties report their, they have to give quarterly reports to HUD when they get these grants. And when they give the data to them, they never give identified data that would tell you whether or not there's a child in a home that's had work done. So it's actually all separated. So they should and do have this data available, which is how many other cities and states provide that data to, publicly. They publish it on websites for people to be able to search. So it is available. It's just a question of how easy it is to get it. That answers the question.
So we have a question from Sean Hamill for Dr. Lanphier. What do you think about the federal lead level limit, 15 parts per billion, before extra federal oversight is mandated? Is it a conservative level, or does it need to be even lower? Should people in towns with lead levels at or near 15 parts per billion need to be worried and avoid drinking the water or getting filters, etc.?
So Allison talked about how that evolved, and it's actually like most other lead standards. They've all been based on what an agency felt was feasible to achieve, not the best available science. This was quite a shock to me. My first study was largely misrepresented, not because of ill intent, but because EPA officials didn't think that we could achieve dust lead levels that low, so they went behind closed doors and acted like it was science. In terms of the water lead level, the 15 part per billion is similar, as Allison described. If we tried to look at a health action level, which EPA was supposed to release in 2015, what should it be? I would say at a minimum less than 5 parts per billion, and ultimately less than 1 part per billion. That may take a little time to achieve. It won't happen overnight because we still have the aging infrastructure of lead service lines, but that should be what we try to achieve. And how we get there won't be easy, but certainly less than 5 parts per billion for a health action level, and ultimately less than 1.
Thank you. We have a question from Tony Barbosa of the LA Times for the reporters. How have you successfully overcome medical HIPAA-related obstacles to blood lead data, and also, and I think you may have answered this already, to elaborate on what information from HUD is of interest and what it can show?
Right. I mean, I'll just say again that this is Bree, that we've had success in some areas and still are fighting in others. So some sources seem to be very open to sharing data, and others seem to be using HIPAA to hide behind. And perhaps it's just a misunderstanding of what or an overabundance of caution. We found that the school districts often use that as well, and there is also de-identified data available through school districts. So it's something to push on and to really see if you can find allies. There's, locally we have help from university here that's done research in the past on lead poisoning and has had access to data, so they've been able to help us. And HUD has just a world of data that they get because their grantees are required to report to them quarterly to give them progress on all of the homes that they've been in, the work that they've done, and really to be accountable for the money that they've received.
And this is Allison. One thing that we tried to work with the blood lead data when we did the Ghost Factories project, and we were able to get it in some places and not in others, and HIPAA was just a massive barrier. And for a national project, it's particularly difficult. But one of the things that we did that I think is worthwhile for reporters to consider doing is we basically created a medical release form. And when I was going out into neighborhoods and testing people's soil, I asked the families whether their kids had blood lead tests and if they'd be willing to let me get that information and include it in the story. And so I had them fill out forms. I took, iPhone photos of their driver's licenses, and then I was able to, since blood lead levels are notifiable to health departments, I was able to get their test results, which often they couldn't remember the amounts directly from the health departments. But it doesn't give you macro level information, but potentially you have the ability to canvass in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Allison. That just sounds so meticulous and time-consuming as an effort, though. It's incredible. But question here from Barbara Feder-Ostrov of Kaiser Health News. She says, can any of the panelists address lead contamination issues in the workplace, such as recycling, battery, painting industries? Workers may be exposed and then bring lead dust back home with them.
So there probably is a lot of exposure that's overlooked, certainly in some industries like construction that are really hard to regulate. The traditional lead industries like a lead smelter or a battery recycling plant probably do a better job on one level. On another level, because it's such highly concentrated source, it's still very possible that they're taking exposures home. So this is an area I think that could be delved into to a much greater extent. We certainly know that this is a huge issue internationally. We know, for example, there's a Canadian company, Dominion, that still sells leaded paint to low to middle income countries. And so what's happened with many other toxins, whether it's DDT, tobacco, is that when we restrict or ban their use in North America, they get sold elsewhere, and that's going to become a big issue for the workplace, carry home there, and of course products are going to be transported back to North America that might contain lead. So it's a big issue. Getting down into specific occupations is tricky, but one other thing to recognize is that the standards for blood lead in adults is still set very high, 25 microgram per deciliter, 250 parts per billion, despite evidence that it should be lowered dramatically. So that's another whole area ripe for a journalist to take on, or actually a couple dozen.
Another journalism question, how did Allison specifically find these lead smelter sites that have not been remediated?
So there was an article in the American Journal of Public Health that ran a long time ago that I happened to read because I'm a lead smelter geek. I can't help myself. And I'd always wondered, it warned, the researcher, Bill Eckel, had as part of his thesis, had identified by going through old directories, the standard metals directories, these old B2B paper directories from the 20s, 30s through 60s, old lead selling factories. They purportedly were factories. He checked out a handful of them and found that they actually were factories, and warned in this paper that the EPA or someone should be looking into these sites. And I always wondered, did they do it? And so we actually systematically took his initial list, which he hadn't had the time or the resources to check out all of them, and we checked out all of them on the list, and we're able to document that 465, 200 of them had actually been factories rather than business offices. But there's much more work that can be done in that area by looking at these old business directories. I mean, zinc factories and other industrial complexes would have the same issues. So we looked at that. We looked at these things called Sanborn fire insurance maps, which are incredibly cool. There usually is a research library in your community that has a digital or paper collection of them. These were the Google Street View before there was computers. Fire insurance companies sent these people out and literally did these beautiful, incredibly precise maps. If you go to our Ghost Factory's website, in the interactive, you'll be able to see we've laid them down over Google Maps, and they match precisely. It's stunning, given what the level of technology was at the time. But they diagrammed what was in our communities going back into the 1800s, and you can take a look at neighborhoods and see what their industrial legacy was. And there are great stories to be done there, as we've, especially in inner city areas, to see what was there before and what is there now, and what are the potential threats that are there.
Thank you for that really expansive answer. We have a question from Marjorie Mazaire, who asks, she says, I believe that lead level testing is from 6 months to 6 years. I see a tendency that pediatricians tend to order lead level testing after 18 months. Do you think earlier testing could decrease the outcomes of high blood levels and prevent complications?
I'll take that. Yes, most definitely. But I think first and foremost, what we should be doing is screening the environment. Screening children will ultimately fail to protect them because we use them as biological indicators of substandard housing. So when we identify a child, for example, who has a blood lead over 5, we wave our hands and we get excited and we go measure the home. But we ultimately have failed that child. We failed to prevent lead exposure for that child. And so the first thing that we should be looking at is how do we identify those hotspots, whether it's old smelters, old housing that's in poor repair or recently renovated, lead service lines, and get in there and do that. The screening of children is important, but it's really a safety net to find out when we failed, not as our primary focus. And the idea, one other real quick point is that we oftentimes lump children together who are, let's say, 6 months to 5 or 6 years. If we do that, we will underestimate dramatically the number of children who ever had and have an elevated blood lead level. Children's blood lead levels tend to peak around 2 years of age because of the confluence of mouthing behaviors and mobility. And so that's going to be a better indicator, that age group, of ongoing lead exposure in a community.
And we have a related question from Teresa Wright, who says, in addition to testing homes, why can't testing be conducted regularly on schools, since children spend similar hours to their home as they do in school?
I'll start. Maybe somebody else has something to add. The schools' water fountains, for the most part, are exempt from EPA standards and fall outside of any existing standards, so they oftentimes have been neglected. In terms of the exposures to old paint and dust, particularly in daycare centers where young children are, that could be extremely important. As children become older, it will be less important because kids aren't doing as much of the mouthing behaviors and so on, but it certainly is a possible source. And as importantly, it can cost a tremendous amount of money to do lead abatement. And if you're not familiar with the public nuisance case in California where there was an award of $1.15 billion, now it's under appeal, there may be some interesting solutions that different states or cities should employ, although in some cities in like Ohio, the lead industry was able to bar cities from suing the paint and pigment industries, which is a whole nother interesting story that Bree could tell you about.
Well, building on that is a question by Amy Kraft from CBS Interactive, who asks if the panelists can talk about examples of towns that are successfully getting and keeping lead out of the water supply.
Wow. So this is Allison. I mean, I think one of the big questions here, and I think it's an important story that journalists ought to be asking in their own communities, is just because your community's water system doesn't show up on the USA Today list of those that have had action level exceedances for lead, does it mean that there is no problem? When you look really closely at how this testing is done, the reality is that the vast majority, so a really huge city water system, like something in New York City, the maximum number of tap samples that need to be taken is only 100. And smaller water systems test fewer, and if you're on reduced sampling, it might be even 50 in a large water system. So number one, how we're testing may not really fully detect the issues. There are examples of cities that are doing a lot to start removing the lead service lines. And that's something also we can be reporting on and looking at closely. You know, where are there concerted efforts to remove lead service lines? Places like Wichita and Lansing, Michigan. There are a number of places that are taking those actions. But we also need to ask questions about when they say that they're removing a lead service line, did they remove the whole service line, or did the utility only remove their portion and leave the other half that's on the homeowner's property? And there is some interesting science about whether or not there's the potential for increased corrosion when you have a partial service line replacement. So those are all really good stories still to be done.
We have a question that perhaps, I don't know, Jessica, if you want to try replying to from Angela Hornsby and perhaps others too, how would you suggest that community leaders in urban areas become involved to raise awareness?
Well, I think there are a number of things that people could do perhaps to raise awareness. I mean, I think the first is to improve people's access generally to resources. So, I mean, I think that, the lead poisoning is, sort of a symptom, again, of larger issues that people are facing, whether it be, again, limited access to good housing, limited access to good jobs, limited access to good health care. All of those conditions existed in Flint. And so that when people end up facing things like the lead poisoning crisis in Flint, they really have limited resources to deal with these problems and to combat them. And again, they're really vulnerable to bad government decisions because they have such few resources, and they're often overlooked and disempowered. And so I think that, providing more opportunities for people and solving some of these major structural issues will help to improve some of these issues like lead poisoning. But, this could happen in a lot of places, as could other things, as a result of high levels of inequality in general.
Well, I think with that, we're going to close our webinar. I want to thank all of our panelists for their comments. This has really been illuminating, and to thank our participants for their excellent questions. Just a reminder that we will have this webinar archived, and you can refer to it later along with the PowerPoints of all of our speakers. Thank you all so very much.